Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back, all the way to the banks of the Nile, where the air was hot, the pyramids loomed, and people were, well, not quite as sober as your high school textbooks might have suggested. So if you're curled up in bed, lights dimmed, and just looking for something to lull you off to sleep, relax, because we're going to wander slowly through the hazy, perfumed, slightly inebriated corners of ancient Egypt. Now, when you picture ancient Egyptians, you probably think of elegant temples, solemn priests, and pharaohs issuing divine decrees and perfect golden crowns. What we don't usually imagine is that the same people may have been stumbling around in altered states, clutching jars of beer, and sniffing substances that would get you kicked out of most modern airports. Yes, the ancient Egyptians were very spiritual. They were also very experimental. Let's start with the basics. Beer, because of course we're starting with beer. In ancient Egypt, beer was less a casual weekend beverage and more a way of life. You drank it if you were poor. You drank it if you were rich. You even drank it if you were a child. In fact, beer was safer than water, which, considering the Nile was full of crocodiles and the occasional floating body, was probably the right choice. But here's the part that doesn't always get mentioned. Egyptian beer wasn't like your crisp little bottle of Heineken. No, it was thick, lumpy, sometimes chewed before being brewed. Imagine a half-fermented oatmeal soup with bubbles, and you're about there. And yet, they loved it. People lined up daily to get their beer ration, because nothing says civilization like being slightly tipsy before noon. Still, beer was the tame stuff. If you wanted to get properly elevated, you had other options. The Egyptians knew their plants. They had fields, gardens, and temples stocked with herbs whose names sound poetic, until you realize they were also narcotics. Blue lotus, for example, beautiful flower, pretty petals, grows serenely on the Nile. But when you steep it in wine, suddenly you're less peaceful farmer and more otherworldly visionary floating through the ceiling. Blue lotus was sacred. The Egyptians carved it on tomb walls. They painted it in banquet scenes. Pharaohs were shown holding it delicately, which was basically the ancient equivalent of an Instagram influencer showing off their favorite, let's say, wellness product. Except this one didn't just smell nice. It made you feel like the gods were whispering directly into your ears. Archaeologists have even found traces of this stuff in burial sites, suggesting they didn't just enjoy it while alive. No, they thought, better pack some for the afterlife. Imagine believing heaven might not be bearable without your floral narcotic tea. But let's not stop at flowers, because of course, they didn't. The Egyptians also played with opium. Yes, the same opium that would later fuel entire wars and Victorian addictions. Was it common? Not really. But in elite circles, there's evidence that poppies were grown and harvested for their dreamy little latex pods. High-ranking Egyptians, priests, nobles, maybe even pharaohs, were no strangers to drifting off in an opium haze, which really explains a lot about some of the decisions made in the throne room. And then there's hemp. Oh yes, cannabis in the ancient world wasn't limited to far-off Scythians in fur trousers. The Egyptians too had access to hemp. It was practical, well, of course. Rope, linen, medicine. But medicine often doubles as, let's say, recreational therapy. Some medical papyri describe cannabis being used for pain relief. inflammation, even childbirth. Did some of that pain relief occasionally drift into accidental giggling fits under the pyramids? I'll let you decide. Now, if all of this makes ancient Egypt sound like one long rave in the desert, I should clarify. These substances weren't always about fun. They were often about religion, getting closer to the gods, tripping slightly harder than your neighbor during temple rituals. Because in their worldview, altered states weren't embarrassing, they were divine. Take the priests. They weren't just chanting quietly while burning incense. Some of that incense, by the way, contained psychoactive ingredients, meaning the more the temple filled with smoke, the more the priests connected. To whom? Well, hopefully to the gods, though probably also to the ceiling beams they thought were moving. And incense was everywhere. Frankincense, myrrh, kifi, this special temple blend made of honey, wine, raisins, herbs, and probably a few ingredients no one could ever fully agree on. Burn it, inhale it, and suddenly your midnight ritual got a lot more intense. It's one thing to pray. It's another to pray while floating out of your own body. Banquets, too, were not exactly dry affairs. Egyptians threw feasts for everything. Weddings, funerals, random Tuesday evenings. The wine flowed, and the wine wasn't always just grapes. Sometimes it was spiked with herbs. Strong herbs, the kind that made you see colors a little differently. Picture a grand hall with music, dancers, food, and half the guests slowly realizing their cups contain more than just fermented fruit juice. The funny part is, archaeologists have confirmed this. Residue analyses of ancient jars have turned up traces of herbs and additives that weren't about taste. They were about effect. So yes, when the nobles toasted the gods, they may have been doing so while seeing said gods hovering in the corner of the room. Naturally, not everyone approved. Some conservative voices, scribes, moralists, warned against excess. They wrote little notes about the dangers of too much wine, too much indulgence. Don't drink beer to excess. One papyrus scolds, sounding suspiciously like every parent on prom night, which of course meant people ignored it completely. And here's a detail you might enjoy. In Egyptian art, especially on tomb walls, you'll sometimes see party scenes. Rows of women with blue lotus flowers in their hair, musicians playing harps, servants pouring wine. Everyone looks serene. What you don't see is the vomiting that reportedly followed, because ancient Egyptian parties were not polite little dinners. They were loud, messy, and sometimes ended in people passing out on the floor, which makes sense, given all the special enhancements in their drinks. But perhaps the most surreal part of all this? The blending of the sacred and the recreational. Egyptians didn't always separate fun from faith. Getting intoxicated wasn't just allowed, it was often encouraged, at least in the right context. Drunkenness festivals, for example. Yes, actual religious celebrations where the goal was to drink until you collapsed, because that's how you honored certain gods, particularly Hathor, goddess of love, music, and, apparently, regrettable hangovers. Imagine a whole crowd, swaying, singing, staggering around temples in Hathor's name. It sounds chaotic, it probably was, but to them, it was divine chaos. By losing themselves, they thought they were touching the divine, which is kind of poetic. if also very sticky. And of course, no discussion of Egyptian intoxication is complete without mentioning their medicine. Medical papyri contain endless recipes. Some are straightforward: garlic for the heart, honey for wounds. But others read like something scribbled in the margins of a stoner's notebook. Grind this plant, mix with beer, say a spell, and drink. That last step, almost always drink, which tells you a lot about Egyptian healthcare. Most cures started with, have another round. Now, let's pause here, because if you're drifting off to sleep, this is the part where the details melt together into something soft and hazy. The Nile, the temples, the flickering torches, and somewhere in the background, the faint scent of blue lotus drifting through the air. Relax, breathe, because we're about to wander deeper into the dreamlike haze of ancient Egyptian highs. Hey everyone, tonight we're leaving behind the dust of Egypt, with its priests, its incense, and its suspiciously strong herbs, and wandering instead into a world of lace, velvet, and dangerous cosmetics. The Renaissance. This was the rebirth of Europe, or at least, the rebirth of Europe's rich people. Artists were painting, sculptors were chiseling, and monarchs were spending ruinous fortunes trying to look attractive in portraits. The peasants, of course, were still eating turnips and hoping not to die of plague. But if you had money, the Renaissance was your stage, and beauty was the performance. Now, let's settle into the details. Imagine you're a noblewoman in Florence, or perhaps in Venice, a city where even the gondoliers wore more embroidery than seems reasonable. You're expected to look elegant, refined, and pale, very pale. So pale you might be confused for a marble statue that escaped from a cathedral. This wasn't easy. It required effort, sacrifice, and a willingness to slowly poison yourself for fashion. Foreheads of glory. Let's begin at the top, your hairline. In the Renaissance, a high, broad forehead was considered the height of elegance. A forehead that suggested wisdom, nobility, and a vague sense of looking permanently startled. To achieve this, women plucked, not just the brows, but the hairline itself. Servants sat with tweezers, carefully ripping out hairs one by one, until the brow line crept dangerously far up the skull. Some women rubbed vinegar-soaked cloths on their foreheads to thin the hair faster. Others burned it away with quick passes of a candle flame. The result was a forehead you could land a small carriage on. Eyebrows were unwelcome too. Thin, faint, or ideally invisible. Painstakingly removed until the brow ridge became a smooth, pale slope. Artists like Piero della Francesca and Botticelli painted women with these bare expanses, giving them that iconic Renaissance look. Calm, serene, and just slightly alien. The pursuit of pallor. Now the skin. Pale skin was non-negotiable. It shouted wealth. It whispered refinement. It said, I have never worked a day in the fields, though my peasants certainly have. The problem was, not everyone was naturally ghostly, so recipes abounded for lightening the complexion. One of the most common ingredients was white lead, mixed into creams, pastes, and powders. Lead gave a flawless porcelain glow. Unfortunately, it also gave lead poisoning. Symptoms included grayish skin, hair loss, and eventually death. But at least you looked fashionable in the coffin. Vinegar washes were another favorite. They brightened the skin, though mostly by irritating it. Chalk was ground and dusted over the face. Egg whites were smeared on to tighten and stiffen the skin, producing a glossy finish. Women sometimes walked around with their faces stretched and shiny, like human porcelain dolls. It was considered radiant. Freckles were the enemy. Remedies included lemon juice, onion water, and, rather charmingly, pigeon droppings. Did they work? Not really, but the effort mattered. If your skin looked blotchy, you were assumed to have bad humors, or worse, peasant blood. Rouge and mercury. Of course, pallor alone made you look like you'd already died of plague. Color had to be added back in, but carefully. Cheeks were painted with vermilion, made from powdered mercury sulfide. Yes, mercury. Yes, toxic. But it gave a bold red flush that contrasted nicely with the white face paint. If you survived long enough, you looked dazzling. Lips too were tinted, sometimes with crushed cochineal insects from the New World, sometimes with cinnabar. The effect was dramatic. Ghostly pale skin, cheeks blazing, lips glowing. Essentially, a Renaissance vampire chic. Eyes of belladonna. Then came the eyes. Wide, dark, soulful. This was achieved with belladonna, meaning beautiful woman. The juice of deadly nightshade was dropped into the eyes to dilate the pupils. The result? A soft, unfocused gaze that artists adored. The price? Blurred vision, terrible headaches, and eventual blindness, which meant many noble women stumbled elegantly around, unable to see the suitor they were meant to charm. But beauty requires sacrifice, and apparently also the risk of walking into furniture. Coal and soot were used to darken the lashes and lids. Sometimes antimony powder was applied, another toxic mineral. The Renaissance was essentially a contest to see how many different poisons could be applied to the human body in the name of beauty. Renaissance blonde. Hair was another battlefield. Blonde was ideal. Blonde meant angelic. Blonde meant Venus herself. The trouble was, not everyone in Florence was born Botticelli's Venus. So bleaching methods were devised. Women smeared their hair with a mixture of saffron, alum, and sometimes urine. Then they sat in the sun for hours, wearing wide-brimmed hats with the crown cut away, exposing only the hair to the rays. This was called a solarium. Imagine rows of noble women sitting on balconies, their heads baking in the Italian sun, their hair sizzling with chemical concoctions. The smell was probably not heavenly, but the results, after enough suffering, were golden. Brunettes tried too. Henna was imported from the East for reddish tints. Walnut shells darkened hair to a rich brown, but blonde held the throne. By the late Renaissance, even men were bleaching their beards. The codpiece and male vanity. Now, let's not assume this was all women's burden. Men had their own Renaissance beauty rituals, and they were no less absurd. Enter the codpiece. Originally, it was just a practical flap covering the gap between the two legs of men's hose. But practical things never stayed practical long in fashion. By the 16th century, the codpiece had evolved into a padded, stuffed, and often jeweled declaration of masculinity. Some were enormous, protruding like miniature siege engines. Some had embroidery. Some even had tassels. They were not subtle. They were not dignified. But they were, apparently, irresistible. Nobles strutted around with their codpieces proudly displayed, while tailors competed to outdo one another in size and absurdity. If the Renaissance gave us great art, it also gave us men dressing like a circus attraction below the waist. Fabrics and layers. Fashion itself was about excess. Layers upon layers. Gowns of velvet, silk, and brocade. Sleeves puffed and slashed so that brightly colored linings could bulge out dramatically. Collars stiff with starch, growing higher and wider with each decade. Rough collars eventually became so enormous they resembled satellite dishes. Every part of the body had to declare wealth. Even undergarments were embroidered. A nobleman's doublet might be padded to give him a barrel chest, regardless of his actual physique. A noblewoman's gown might weigh more than she did, heavy with pearls, gold thread, and fur. Comfort was not the goal. Display was. If you fainted under the weight, well, at least you fainted expensively. Shoes and silhouette. Shoes followed suit. Pointed shoes grew so long they had to be tied to the legs with chains to prevent tripping. Later, in Venice, chopines, platform shoes, became popular. Some were over 2 feet high. Women tottered precariously, supported by servants on either side, swaying like dangerous chandeliers. They weren't so much walking as performing a balancing act. But again, that was the point. If you could barely move, it meant you were rich enough never to need to hurry. Silhouettes changed too. In Spain, stiff farthingales created enormous bell-shaped skirts. In France, sleeves ballooned. In England, ruffs swallowed faces. Each region competed in eccentricity. Each portrait became an arms race of lace, fabric, and padding. Perfume instead of soap. Now, let's drift to cleanliness, or rather, the lack of it. Baths were rare, too rare. Many people believed bathing spread disease by opening the pores. So instead, perfumes were used. Strong ones. Musk, civet, ambergris, rosewater. Gloves were soaked in them. Hair was sprinkled with them. Even clothing was perfumed. The result was less fresh meadow and more overwhelming cloud. Court gatherings must have smelled like a spice market colliding with a zoo. But again, it was better than the alternative. Perfume meant refinement. Soap meant peasantry. Jewelry and display. Jewelry was everywhere. Pearls were especially treasured, symbolizing purity. Diamonds, rubies, and emeralds glittered in rings. Brooches and girdles. Necklaces were layered until the neck nearly vanished beneath the weight. But jewels weren't just decoration. They carried symbolism. A ruby meant passion. A sapphire meant loyalty. A pearl meant chastity. Though, ironically, the most famously unchaste women often wore the largest pearls. Portraits doubled as propaganda, each jewel telling a story about virtue, power, or status. Sumptuary laws. All this extravagance worried governments. So sumptuary laws were passed, dictating who could wear what. Velvet might be restricted to nobility. Certain colors, like deep purple or saffron yellow, might be reserved for royalty. Tailors could be fined for clothing a merchant's wife above her station. Did anyone obey? Of course not. The middle classes adored flouting the rules, sneaking in extra lace, richer fabrics, brighter dyes. The laws mostly just gave courts an excuse to fine people. Fashion policing became its own industry. Portraits as propaganda, and then there were portraits. Every noble wanted one, painted not as they were, but as they wished to be remembered, which meant smooth skin, impossibly tiny waists, and foreheads vast enough to host a banquet. Kings had themselves painted taller, broader, more commanding. Queens were idealized into saintly visions. The result is that most of our images of Renaissance beauty are essentially propaganda, 16th century Photoshop. Corsets and control. Corsetry also entered fashion. Stiffened bodices, squeezed waists, flattened busts, and forced postures upright. Some were made of whalebone, some of iron. They could bruise ribs, restrict breathing, and make fainting almost inevitable. But the shape, the long torso, the lifted bust, was considered essential. Fashion, after all, was rarely about comfort. Everyday oddities, even daily habits, became rituals of beauty. Women washed their faces with milk. Men dyed their beards strange shades. Wigs were worn to hide baldness, sometimes dyed, sometimes perfumed, sometimes crawling with lice. Powdered sugar was even dusted onto lips to sweeten kisses, though it mostly attracted flies. Superstition crept in too. Certain stones were worn to ward off illness. Certain colors were thought to attract good fortune, and, as always, odd numbers were preferred in spells and beauty charms. The line between cosmetics and magic was thin. The cost of beauty. And so, as we drift through candlelit courts and perfumed chambers, one thing becomes clear. Beauty in the Renaissance was exhausting. It demanded time, money, and health. It meant blindness from belladonna, poisoning from lead, disfigurement from mercury. It meant fainting in roughs and tottering on chopines. But it also meant status. Appearances were everything. If you didn't look the part, you didn't play the role. The Renaissance gave us art, music, and philosophy. But it also gave us foreheads plucked bald, cheeks burning with mercury, and men proudly strutting around with codpieces that could double as storage units. It was, in short, beautiful and ridiculous, which, naturally, is the perfect recipe for a bedtime story. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're floating away to Edo, Japan, a place of sliding doors, painted screens, and a frankly impractical number of kimonos. And of course, a time where people were secretly, or not so secretly, obsessed with tattoos. Not the delicate little minimalist tattoos you might be imagining. No discreet infinity symbols behind the ear, or ironic mustache tattoos on the finger. No, we're talking entire bodies covered in elaborate, swirling scenes of dragons, heroes, demons, and waterfalls. Designs that looked less like art on skin and more like someone had accidentally walked into a woodblock print and then never walked out again. This was Irizumi, the art of Japanese tattooing, part punishment, part decoration, and eventually, part rebellion. It was vibrant, painful, and about as subtle as a fire-breathing dragon wrapped around your torso. So let's dim the lights, settle into bed, and drift slowly into the ink-stained underbelly of Edo, Japan. Now, if you want to understand Japanese tattooing in the Edo period, you have to start with its reputation, which was not great. Tattoos, in the early days, were not an edgy fashion choice. They were a punishment. In fact, if you stole something in certain provinces, Congratulations. You might be rewarded with a permanent tattoo across your forehead. Maybe a straight line, maybe a symbol, a mark that said to everyone, yes, this man is terrible at crime. Please treat accordingly. And naturally, once you had a tattoo, good luck marrying, working, or, well, existing in polite society. It was branding, social exile made permanent, which means, ironically, the entire tattoo tradition in Japan began not with art, but with humiliation. But, as tends to happen, humans being humans, someone, somewhere looked at these marks of shame and thought, well, actually, if we add a few waves here, and maybe a dragon there, this could be sort of beautiful. And from that spark, punishment tattoos slowly transformed into elaborate body art. The Edo period, roughly 1603 to 1868, was a time of strict order. The Tokugawa shogunate had taken control. They were extremely fond of rules, hierarchies, and making sure that everyone stayed firmly in their lane. Samurai had their codes. Merchants knew their place. Farmers grew the rice, which was basically the only thing anyone seemed to talk about. And in this climate of restriction, tattoos became a little bit dangerous. They weren't officially banned for art's sake at first, but they weren't exactly encouraged either. They were for the people on the margins, firemen, laborers, prostitutes, people who already weren't at the top of polite society. And of course, nothing makes something cooler than telling society it isn't respectable. So by the late Edo period, tattoos had exploded into an underground art form. Entire full-body suits, from the neck to the ankles, became fashionable among working men, especially the firemen, who needed to strip down when battling flames, and therefore ended up essentially showing off massive walking ukiyo-e art galleries on their bodies. Picture it, firefighters rushing into burning buildings, half naked, covered in dragons, clouds, and crashing waves. It was basically the world's most intimidating calendar shoot. Now, where did all these designs come from? Conveniently, Edo was also the golden age of ukiyo-e, those famous woodblock prints of actors, courtesans, and mythical scenes. And one book in particular gave tattooing its visual explosion, The Water Margin or Sukuden, a Chinese novel about 108 outlaws, rebels, and bandits. The story was published in Japan with woodblock illustrations that showed the heroes covered in tattoos, demons, tigers, carp, and blossoms. And naturally, Japanese men looked at this and thought, yes, that's the aesthetic. Criminal chic. Sign me up. So tattoo artists, who were often the same people carving woodblocks, took their skills from paper to skin. The same bold outlines, the same limited color palette, the same heroic, slightly over-the-top poses. Except now, the canvas was someone's back, thighs, and chest. Tattooing in Edo, Japan was not gentle. Today, if you want a tattoo, you walk into a nice clean studio. You're offered a chair, maybe a numbing cream. Your artist wears gloves. In Edo, Japan, you were sitting in a back room. The artist had some sharpened needles, tied together in bundles, dipped in soot-based ink, and then he tapped them into your skin by hand, over and over, for hours. No anesthetic, no painkillers, just the rhythmic tapping of ink and needle, like someone politely hammering art into your body, stroke by stroke. And people didn't go small. They went for massive, full body works. A proper suit could take months, even years, to complete. The commitment was, let's say, impressive, or, depending on your pain tolerance, possibly insane. Of course, as tattoos became more widespread, the authorities became nervous. Tattoos weren't exactly part of the Confucian ideal of order, respectability, and obedience, so the shogunate started cracking down. Bans were issued. Tattooing was declared illegal in 1720, which naturally made it more popular. Because nothing is more appealing than forbidden ink, tattooing became a symbol of defiance. You weren't just decorating yourself. You were saying, yes, I know society disapproves, but look at my dragon. It's bigger than your entire sense of propriety. The artistry reached incredible levels. Dragons that coiled around the torso, waves crashing across shoulders, cherry blossoms scattered across thighs, mythological heroes fighting battles across someone's back. And when fully clothed, no one knew. The tattoos were carefully placed so that they would be invisible under robes. But when the kimono slipped off, there it was, an entire world of swirling color and ink, like a secret identity. The cultural clash here is fascinating. On one hand, Japan admired beauty, art, and ukiyo-e prints. On the other, tattoos were considered shameful, dangerous, and criminal, which left tattooed men in this strange liminal space, respected for their beauty, feared for their defiance, desired for their exotic mystery, but never fully accepted. And this stigma lasted. Even today, tattoos in Japan are linked to the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, who adopted full-body irizumi suits as a symbol of loyalty and toughness. Bathhouses and gyms still ban tattooed customers. And yet, the artistry is world famous. It's a contradiction that Edo Japan lived with too. Tattoos were outlawed, but everyone knew someone who had them. Everyone secretly admired the fireman, half naked in the street, covered in dragons. Everyone looked at those Sukoden prints and thought, I wish I had the courage. Let's drift for a moment into the details of the designs. Dragons, of course, were popular. Not the European style. No winged lizards breathing fire. Japanese dragons were serpentine. Long, winding, wise. They represented power, water, and protection. Having one across your back suggested strength and resilience. Carp, koi fish, were another classic. Swimming upstream, transforming into dragons. A story of perseverance. Tattoos of carp flowing across thighs and arms symbolized toughness and a quiet hope that you too could rise above your station. Cherry blossoms were scattered everywhere, fragile, short-lived, endlessly admired. A reminder that beauty and life are fleeting, which is exactly the kind of poetic melancholy Edo men loved to wear on their skin. And then there were demons, Oni, with bulging eyes and snarling teeth, heroes battling them, waves crashing, clouds swirling. It was a universe painted directly onto flesh, a universe you carried with you at all times. Of course, not everyone was impressed. The upper classes thought tattoos were vulgar. Samurai, in particular, looked down on them. A warrior didn't need ink to prove his courage. He had a sword for that. Tattoos were for commoners, laborers, outcasts. But that was precisely the point. Tattoos became a class rebellion, a statement that you didn't need permission from society to create beauty, a declaration that your body was your own canvas. So while the shogunate tried to police appearances, ordinary men were quietly turning themselves into masterpieces. We should pause here to mention the irony. Tattooing in Edo was illegal, but foreign visitors, Europeans especially, were fascinated by it. Sailors in particular would line up to get tattooed in Japanese ports, and when they went home, they showed off their exotic ink, telling stories about mysterious masters with needles and ink blocks. So while Japan was trying to suppress tattooing, the rest of the world was starting to think of it as, well, a tourist attraction. A little ironic, really. By the time the Edo period ended and Japan entered the Meiji era, tattooing was banned again. This time even more firmly. The government didn't want Japan to look backward to the West. They wanted to present themselves as modern, clean, respectable. Tattoos, they decided, were the opposite of that. And yet, the tradition never really died. Artists kept working in secret. Yakuza adopted tattoos as a badge of honor, and foreigners continued to admire them. The body suits, the dragons, the crashing waves, they survived, passed down from Edo firemen to Meiji gangsters to modern enthusiasts. So if you're lying here, listening, and picturing the calm floating rhythm of Edo streets, imagine too the quiet hum of a tattooist's needle, the endless patience, the slow build of an image across months, the fireman stripping down to reveal a dragon coiled around his torso, the merchant secretly marked with blossoms beneath his robes. Tattooing in Edo, Japan was more than art. It was rebellion, identity, and pain endured for beauty's sake. A secret world of ink, drifting just beneath the surface. Hey, everyone. Tonight, let's wander back into the candlelit libraries and boudoirs of the Renaissance, a period when the printing press was busy churning out Bibles, and naturally, also, scandalous little books about love, lust, and things the church very much wished people wouldn't read. Because the Renaissance wasn't just Michelangelo sculpting perfect marble bodies. It wasn't just Florence inventing perspective in painting. It was also a time where the human body, previously treated as something you should mostly ignore, suddenly became a subject of fascination. And, inconveniently for moral guardians, fascination tends to drift very quickly toward lust. So while scholars translated Aristotle, others quietly scribbled manuals on how to flirt, how to seduce, and occasionally, how not to get arrested for enjoying yourself. Let's dim the lamps, lean back, and drift into the strangely fragile world of Renaissance love. A world where marriage contracts were ironclad, passions were whispered in secret, and books that might teach you something had to be hidden beneath the floorboards. Now, Renaissance love was rarely about love, at least, not in the way we'd like to imagine. Marriage was business. Families married for land, for power, for a convenient alliance against the unpleasant neighbors. The happy couple themselves, often barely consulted. A 14-year-old girl might be matched with a 35-year-old widower who owned a vineyard. Romantic, in the same way tax paperwork is romantic. But of course, people are still people, and people do not survive long on alliances and land deeds alone, which meant that love and lust usually existed outside of marriage, sometimes discreetly, sometimes not, and sometimes recorded in very long, very tedious court documents. This is where the forbidden books come in. You see, with the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, suddenly books could be mass-produced, which meant, of course, the classics of antiquity could return. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, his cheerful little guide to love and seduction, ancient Roman poetry full of winks, sighs, and rather direct advice. The church was not thrilled. Ovid was banned. His books were burned, which naturally ensured that every university student in Italy wanted a copy. And so Ovid's verses were whispered, hidden, copied by hand, smuggled in under false titles. The same went for Boccaccio's Decameron, a book that pretended to be about surviving the plague, but was actually 90% stories of priests, nuns, and bored aristocrats falling into bed with each other. Naturally, it became a bestseller. And let's not forget Pietro Artino, nicknamed the Scourge of Princes. He wrote poetry so scandalous it made Ovid look restrained. He described, in loving detail, things one could do in bed, or on the floor, or up against a Renaissance column that the Vatican would definitely not have approved of. His work circulated secretly, complete with engravings by Giulio Romano. And yes, these engravings were about as subtle as you think. But here's the thing. While men passed around these books, women were expected to remain ignorant. A Renaissance woman of good family wasn't supposed to read much at all. Certainly not that. Her job was to embroider cushions, play the lute, and look mildly decorative while her husband conducted affairs with the maid. And yet, women found ways. Some noble women had private libraries, tucked away with forbidden volumes disguised in respectable bindings. Some read medical treatises that were really very thinly veiled guides to pleasure, and others, frankly, wrote their own. Of course, we can't discuss Renaissance love without mentioning the awkward subject of contraception. The church's official stance was very clear. No, children were gifts from God. Every act of love should, ideally, result in a squalling infant. Reality, however, was messier. Renaissance couples, especially those not keen on a dozen hungry mouths, quietly experimented. They used herbal concoctions, sheep gut condoms imported from France, linen sheets soaked in vinegar. Was any of this particularly reliable? Not really. But when the alternative was an awkward conversation with your confessor, people were willing to try. And naturally, information about such methods was tucked into those forbidden books, hidden in the margins of medical texts, whispered in women's recipe collections, secret knowledge passed down with a wink and a nod. Let's drift now to the courtly side of things. In theory, Renaissance courtship was all about courtly love, a highly stylized tradition borrowed from medieval troubadours. A man admired a woman from afar. He wrote poetry about her eyes. He sighed dramatically under her balcony. He swore eternal devotion. In practice, this usually meant writing overwrought sonnets comparing her to Venus, handing them to a servant, and then trying to sneak into her chambers when her husband was out hunting. The poetry of the period is full of this. Petrarch and his endless verses to Laura, who, by the way, was married to someone else. Ronsard, writing endlessly to women who were often half his age. The language of devotion was lofty, but the reality was often lust wrapped in fancy metaphors. Now, let's not forget the role of the church in all of this, because the church was everywhere. Every confession, every marriage contract, every rumor of scandal eventually reached clerical ears. And so the church worked very hard to police desire. Books were banned, writers were condemned, prostitutes were regulated, adulterers were punished, sometimes very publicly. And yet, ironically, priests and monks were some of the worst offenders. Court records from Renaissance Italy are full of accusations. Priests caught in bed with parishioners, monks writing frankly embarrassing love poetry, nuns discovered with secret letters from admirers. In Venice, the state kept official brothels, carefully licensed, partly to control lust and partly to collect taxes. It was a world where desire was everywhere, but always officially denied. Forbidden books, of course, became symbols of this contradiction. Owning one was a small rebellion. Reading one by candlelight was a thrill. Passing one to a friend was an act of defiance. They were banned because they were powerful, because they suggested that the human body was not only for suffering, penance, and duty, it was also for pleasure. And that was a dangerous idea. Picture it. Florence, 1530. A young student, tucked away in a cramped boarding house, reading a smuggled copy of Ovid by flickering candlelight. He laughs quietly at a line about seduction. He memorizes a metaphor, ready to deploy it awkwardly at the next dance. Outside, the bells toll for evening mass. Or Venice, 1570. A woman of 22, married to a man she barely speaks to, opens her chest of linens and slips out a book bound in plain leather. Inside, it's filled with Artino's verses, scandalous, sharp, and daring. She reads a few lines, flushes, then carefully hides it away before the maid enters. This was Renaissance love, never quite safe, always drifting between duty and desire, and always shadowed by books that promised to unlock secrets you weren't supposed to know. Of course, none of this is to say that love didn't exist in marriages. Sometimes, miraculously, couples did grow fond of each other. Some even loved each other genuinely. Letters survive, tender and warm, but those are the exceptions. The rule was contracts, alliances, and the occasional desperate attempt to find passion elsewhere. And so the Renaissance remains a paradox, an age of art, beauty, and exploration, and yet also an age where most people had to hide their desires beneath layers of cloth, contracts, and censorship. But beneath it all, people were still writing, still reading, still laughing nervously over scandalous passages, and still proving, in their quiet rebellions, that human nature has never really changed. So as you drift towards sleep, picture the candlelight on old pages, the ink smudged from too many secret hands, the heavy scent of a locked library, the sound of a quill scratching lines of forbidden poetry. Love, lust, and books, all intertwined, all whispering to each other in the shadows of the Renaissance.